Now that the tenant has provided the balance of the funds that the lease requires, has obtained the keys, and has moved in, what is the role of the listing agent that has now become the property manager? The balance of this chapter will explain that role, and the role, if any, of the tenant's agent who brought the tenant to the property and wrote the lease. One of the mistakes many agents make is getting involved in the lease and the relationship between the tenant and the landlord or property manager after the lease began and the tenant has occupied the property. Here are some typical scenarios that can create problems for a licensee and the broker. For these examples, we are assuming that neither agent has created a valid property management agreement with the landlord. 1. At the move-in walkthrough, both agents attended, and a list was created of both the items that will not be the responsibility of the tenant at move-out, such as stains on the carpet, holes in the walls, etc., as well as some items that need to be addressed by the landlord. Those might be the replacement of something missing, such as a screen on one window, a leaking faucet, or a malfunctioning garage door opener. All the parties sign the document, exchange money and keys, and the agents leave. The agent that represented the tenant is concerned about her client, so for several weeks after the move-in, she calls the listing agent to see how far the landlord has gone to remedy the issues. They talk back and forth, and the tenant's agent calls the tenant to find out if the landlord has taken action. It takes 6 weeks of communication, and the items are finally fixed. Problem? Yes. Neither agent is managing the property. Therefore, there should be no communication between the agents about the problems with the property, nor should either agent talk to the tenant or the landlord about these issues. All communication should be between the tenant and the landlord, and only the tenant and the landlord. Solution? The agent that represented the landlord should execute a property management agreement with the landlord so that he can be part of the communication to solve the issues. 2. Several months after the tenant moved in, the tenant calls the listing agent to tell him that there is a leak under the kitchen sink, and although not an emergency, it needs repair. The listing agent does not call back after several attempts, so the tenant calls the agent that wrote the lease. That agent calls the listing agent, and after a few days, the listing agent calls back. After several attempts to reach the landlord, they finally authorize the listing agent to find a plumber and send the plumber to fix the leak. This goes on for a few weeks. The plumber fixes the leak and calls the listing agent, and he finally gets the landlord to pay the plumber. Problem? Yes. Since neither agent is managing the property, neither agent should be talking to the landlord or the tenant. Solution? Either agent should tell the tenant that since they are not managing the property, they cannot assist in the remedy. If the tenant calls their agent, that agent should avoid the desire to be helpful by telling the tenant that they cannot be involved. That might seem to be in conflict with an agent's obligation to promote and protect the interest of the client. Commissioner's Rule R428-1101A and Article 1 of the Realtor Code of Ethics. Actually, it does. But since we must also follow the rules and the statute that says we must have a property management agreement before managing a property overrides our other obligations. If the tenant's agent does anything, they should call the listing agent one time, tell the listing agent what occurred, and suggest to the listing agent that they remedy the problem with a property management agreement signed by the landlord. If the tenant calls the listing agent, the agent should remind them that they are not managing the property and give them the contact information for the landlord. Or, the listing agent needs to get the owner to sign a property management agreement. 3. Several months after the tenant moves in, the tenant calls the listing agent to tell him about a dispute he is having with the landlord, and as a result, wants to break the lease and move out. The tenant asks the listing agent for advice on how to proceed. Problem? Yes. Again, the listing agent is not managing the property and should not talk to the tenant about the dispute, and certainly should not offer any advice on how to proceed. Solution? Get the landlord to sign a property management agreement so the agent can assist both parties in the dispute and possibly help the landlord hold on to the tenant. Keep in mind that at no time should a licensee provide a client, customer, or tenant any legal advice. advising someone how to break a lease, or anything that comments on the terms and conditions qualify as providing legal advice. Do you see any trend here? It is simple. The tenant's agent should almost never be involved after the tenant moves in, since the tenant's agent would almost never manage the property. Certainly, near the end of the current lease, the agent is within his or her rights to talk to the tenant, since the tenant wants assistance in the negotiation process. This might seem to be in conflict with the entire theory of not communicating with the tenant when an agent is not the property manager. The difference is that the tenant is not seeking assistance in the operation of the lease or an issue about the condition of the property. Instead, the tenant is seeking a new service from the agent to negotiate a lease, and the tenant happens to be already living in the property. At this point, let's look at the role of the property manager, assuming they have executed a property management agreement with the landlord. That agreement might also include the listing and leasing of the property, even though it is not necessary to have a property management agreement in order to list and lease a property. Until the tenant moves in, the role of the property manager runs side by side with their role as the listing agent. There is one important fact to note. Property management begins when there is a tenant in the property. An agent may execute a property management agreement with an owner who has a vacant property. The agent's first duty as a property manager might be to arrange to get the house cleaned and staged for showing, but any listing agent can do that without being a property manager. Reason: there is no tenant in the property. Once the owner signs the property management agreement, the agent begins the process of renting the property. As soon as there is a tenant in the property, their role as property manager begins. Here are some of the primary functions of a property manager. The property manager should act as the eyes and ears of the owner. In many cases, the owner lives out of state, so the owner might rely upon the manager to oversee the property. Listing a property for lease, staging it, arranging for painting, repairs, cleaning, and landscaping. Screening tenants by reviewing credit reports, applications, obtaining references, and any other means to verify the prospective tenant's information. By acting as an advocate for the landlord, the manager should operate to protect the landlord's interests as if the property belonged to the manager. Keep in mind that if the listing agent lists the property for lease, yet does not have a property management agreement executed by the landlord, the agent cannot review the credit report or make any decisions or comments about it to the landlord. As a property manager, the agent is acting as the owner, authorized by the owner to do so. In contrast, someone who is solely a listing agent is not acting as the owner and does have the authorization to review credit reports. The Fair Credit Reporting Act only allows those persons or entities who are extending credit, loaning money, etc., to view a person's credit report. The listing agent is not extending credit or loaning money. The property manager must be aware of any statutory or regulatory requirement for leasing in that community, city, or county. There may be registration obligations, sales, or transaction taxes that the property manager must collect and report. The manager should also be fully aware of any HOA rules, city occupancy codes, and any rules that affect a landlord or tenant. Any lease that the manager uses and the supporting addenda should conform to all industry standards and should include any industry requirement, statutory or regulatory disclosures, etc. These might include pool ordinances, lead-based paint disclosures, crime disclosures, and various HOA and city code disclosures. The property manager should have full knowledge of the Arizona Residential Landlord and Tenant Act and should have copies to provide to a tenant. The property manager should develop a list of vendors who can respond to calls quickly and efficiently on the property. Examples: plumbers, electricians, appliance repair, pool, and landscaping companies and handymen. If the manager has the authorization to pay vendors from the broker's trust account, they should have a system that makes it possible to pay vendors promptly. Without good systems in place and prompt payments, vendors will be reluctant to work for you in the future. As part of the obligation of a property manager, the time will come when you need to evict a tenant. The most common reason for eviction is non-payment of rent. That is not the time to learn the process of eviction, so best to learn it in advance. While some property managers will handle the entire eviction process, it is possible to hire an attorney to manage the eviction from start to finish. Of course, the manager would need to have the owner's approval to pay attorney fees, and the manager would need to have those funds on deposit with the broker to pay the attorney. Section 5 of this class covers the entire eviction process.